The story of public discourse begins not in a newsroom or a glowing screen, but in the dusty stone of ancient Greece, where the agora pulsed like a living organism, a place where citizens gathered to barter, to argue, to shape the very definition of the polis. Imagine the sun beating down on marble columns, the clatter of sandals on packed earth, the murmurs of a crowd that could turn the tide of policy in a single day. It was here that the earliest seeds of what we now call the public sphere were sown, a space that was at once physical and communal, where speech was the currency of power. Yet even in this vibrant marketplace, the philosopher Plato warned of a deeper danger. In his allegory of the cave, he wrote, "The truth is not always what we see, for the shadows on the wall are but reflections of a greater reality." The cave, for Plato, was a metaphor for the limited perspective of those who accept appearances without questioning the source. In the agora, the shadows were the rhetoric of demagogues, the persuasive gestures that could imprison the mind even as the body roamed free. When the Roman Empire rose, the Forum inherited the Greek tradition, expanding it into a grander arena where law, commerce, and spectacle converged. The Roman Forum was more than a marketplace. It was a stage for imperial power and civic participation, a place where the Senate debated, where triumphal arches celebrated conquest, and where the voices of the plebeians could, at least in theory, be heard. Yet the very architecture of the Forum, its towering columns, its open plazas, also imposed a hierarchy. The elite spoke from the rostra, the raised platform, while the masses gathered below, their words carried on the wind but often lost in the echo of authority. The Roman experience taught us that the physical layout of a public space can both enable and constrain dialogue, a theme that will reverberate through every subsequent medium. Fast forward to the 15th century, and the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg ignited a transformation that would rival the shift from oral to written culture. The press was a catalyst, a mechanical heart that pumped ideas across Europe with unprecedented speed. In the midst of the Reformation, Martin Luther's theses, printed in bold Latin and German, traveled from Wittenberg to the streets of Zurich, to the homes of peasants and princes alike. The anecdote of a single printed pamphlet sparking a continent-wide religious upheaval illustrates how a new medium can fracture the monopoly of authority. Luther famously declared, "Here I stand, I can do no other," not only as a personal resolve, but as a proclamation that the printed word could give voice to the individual against the institutional church. The printing press democratized knowledge, turning the private act of reading into a public act of dissent, and it laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment's belief that rational discourse could liberate humanity from superstition. The Enlightenment, with its salons and coffee houses, took the printed word and turned it into a social ritual. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau gathered in the cafes of Paris, exchanging ideas over cups of coffee, their conversations spilling onto pamphlets, journals, and eventually the burgeoning public sphere that Eugen Habermas would later describe. Habermas, in his seminal work The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, defined this realm as a space of social life where private individuals come together as a public to discuss matters of common concern. He argued that the rise of a bourgeois public, mediated by print, allowed for rational critical debate that could check the power of the state. The promise was clear, a society where reason rather than force would shape governance. Yet even as Habermas's ideal took shape, the physicality of the public sphere remained anchored in coffee houses, salons, and printed pamphlets, places you could walk into, leave, and physically occupy. The 19th century brought the telegraph, and soon after, the newspaper became the dominant conduit for mass communication. Newspapers promised to inform the citizenry, to hold power accountable, and to create a shared narrative of national identity. The anecdote of the New York Times coverage of the 1863 Gettysburg Address illustrates how a single article could amplify a moment of political significance into a collective memory. Yet the newspaper also introduced a new form of mediation. Editors and owners could shape the agenda, deciding which voices were amplified and which were silenced. This editorial gatekeeping foreshadowed later concerns about algorithmic curation, showing that each technological leap carries both the promise of wider participation and the risk of new forms of control. When the 20th century unfurled, radio emerged as the first truly auditory mass medium, capable of reaching listeners in the intimacy of their own homes. In the 1930s, the United States experienced a wave of radio broadcasts that would redefine public opinion. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats are a classic example. By speaking directly into the living rooms of millions, Roosevelt bypassed newspapers and political opponents, creating a personal connection that bolstered public confidence during the Great Depression. Yet the same technology also facilitated darker uses. In Nazi Germany, the Reich Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels harnessed radio to disseminate hate and mobilize a nation toward war. The duality of radio, its capacity to comfort and to coerce, underscored a critical lesson. The medium itself carries a message, a point famously articulated by Marshall McLuhan when he declared, "The medium is the message." McLuhan meant that the characteristics of a medium shape the way we think, feel, and interact, independent of the content it carries. The immediacy of radio, its ability to create a shared auditory experience, altered the rhythm of public discourse, compressing time and space in ways that print never could. The post-war era saw television ascend, turning the public sphere into a visual spectacle. Television combined the immediacy of radio with the visual power of film, creating a new arena where images could sway opinions as powerfully as words. The 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates illustrated how televised image could eclipse policy detail. Viewers judged candidates not only on their arguments but on their composure, their facial expressions, their sartorial choices. The medium of television, with its emphasis on visual appeal and sound bites, began to prioritize brevity and emotion over nuanced deliberation, a trend that would deepen with the rise of digital platforms. Enter the internet, the digital tapestry that weaves together text, sound, and image into an interactive, networked space. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, social media platforms emerged, promising to return the public sphere to the hands of the individual. The phrase "global village," coined by McLuhan decades earlier, resurfaced with renewed optimism. The idea was that anyone, anywhere could publish, comment, and mobilize, erasing the barriers of geography and class. The Arab Spring of 2010-2012 offered a vivid illustration of this promise. In Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, activists used Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to organize protests, share footage of police brutality, and garner international solidarity. The rallying cry, "The internet is the new public square," echoed through the streets, as citizens declared that they had reclaimed their voice from authoritarian regimes. Yet even here, the narrative is complex. While the digital tools facilitated coordination, the outcomes were uneven, and in many cases, governments responded by deploying sophisticated surveillance and censorship technologies, turning the same platforms into instruments of repression. To understand the full arc from the agora to the feed, we must also consider the counterarguments that view each medium as fundamentally liberating. The Enlightenment itself was predicated on the belief that the printed word could emancipate humanity from the shackles of tradition. Voltaire's razor-sharp satire, Rousseau's treatises on the social contract, and Diderot's encyclopédie all demonstrate how print expanded the horizon of public debate. Similarly, the internet has been celebrated for its capacity to bypass state-controlled media, offering a decentralized arena where marginalized voices can be heard. The rise of citizen journalism, exemplified by the 2009 Iranian Green Movement's use of Twitter to report on protests, underscores how digital platforms can circumvent censorship and bring real-time accountability to power. Yet the same philosophers who lauded these emancipatory potentials also warned of new forms of domination. Habermas, later in his career, cautioned that the digital public sphere could become fragmented, with private bubbles reinforcing pre-existing beliefs rather than fostering rational critical debate. He warned that the commodification of attention, driven by advertising revenue models, could turn discourse into a market transaction, eroding the very foundations of democratic deliberation. McLuhan's insight that the medium is the message suggests that each new technology reshapes human perception, not merely amplifies it. The shift from the tactile experience of a printed pamphlet to the fleeting scroll of a social media feed alters our attention spans, our capacity for sustained argument, and our willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints. Historical anecdotes further illuminate this tension. The Reformation, sparked by the printing press, did not simply liberate religious thought, it also precipitated wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, and a fracturing of European society. The 1930s radio broadcasts, while empowering leaders like Roosevelt, also enabled totalitarian regimes to manipulate masses. In both cases, the medium amplified both emancipation and oppression, depending on who wielded the power behind the microphone or the press. The pattern repeats in the digital age. The same platform that can amplify a protest hashtag can also be weaponized for disinformation, as seen in the 2016 U.S. election, where bots and targeted ads sowed confusion and polarized the electorate. The technology itself is neutral. It is the social structures, economic incentives, and political motives that determine its impact. The transition from physical to digital public spaces also raises profound philosophical questions about presence and participation. In the ancient agora, the act of speaking required physical presence, bodily gestures, and direct eye contact, fostering a sense of communal responsibility. In the digital feed, presence is mediated through avatars, usernames, and algorithmic timelines. The sense of anonymity can both empower dissenting voices and encourage toxic behavior. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the nature of the public realm, argued that action is the only way in which we can reveal ourselves to others as unique and unrepeatable beings. When action is reduced to a like or a retweet, does it retain that capacity for uniqueness, or does it become a token gesture, a simulation of participation? To further explore this, consider the analogy of a river versus a dam. The river, like the ancient public sphere, flows naturally, carving its own path, sometimes gentle, sometimes tumultuous, but always subject to the terrain it traverses. The dam, representing modern algorithmic platforms, redirects the flow, storing some water for controlled release while diverting other currents away. The dam can generate power, provide irrigation, and protect against floods, yet it also controls which areas receive water and which are left dry. In the same way, algorithms curate content, prioritize certain voices, and suppress others, shaping the very shape of public discourse. The river analogy reminds us that while the medium can be harnessed for good, it also imposes its own constraints. When we examine the modern claim of the global village, we must also ask whether this village is truly inclusive or merely a collection of echo chambers. The digital age has enabled unprecedented connectivity, yet studies have shown that users often inhabit filter bubbles, where algorithms present content that aligns with pre-existing preferences. This phenomenon can be traced back to the early days of television, where audience segmentation led to the creation of niche channels, and to print, where partisan newspapers catered to specific readerships. The pattern persists. Each medium promises a universal public sphere, yet often delivers a fragmented landscape of specialized communities. The philosophical lineage from Plato's cave to McLuhan's medium can be seen as a continuous dialogue about how technology shapes perception. Plato warned that shadows on the wall could become the only reality for those who never leave the cave. In the digital age, the shadows are the curated feeds, the algorithmic timelines that present a filtered version of reality. If we remain within these curated walls, we risk mistaking the feed for the world itself, losing sight of the broader context. Habermas would argue that a genuine public sphere requires not only access to information, but also the capacity for critical discourse, a space where arguments can be weighed and contested. The digital feed, with its emphasis on speed and virality, often reduces complex issues to sound bites, undermining the depth required for rational debate. Yet, the counterpoint remains compelling. The internet has lowered barriers to entry for political participation. In the early 2000s, the rise of blogs allowed individuals to bypass traditional gatekeepers, offering alternative narratives to mainstream media. The case of the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation, which was later amplified through online platforms, demonstrates how digital dissemination can enhance investigative journalism, bringing hidden truths to light. Moreover, the open-source movement, epitomized by the development of Linux, showcases how collaborative digital spaces can produce sophisticated, decentralized outcomes, challenging the notion that only centralized institutions can create value. In reflecting on the historical trajectory, we also see how each medium reshaped the relationship between the individual and the collective. The agora emphasized communal deliberation, where the citizen's identity was bound to the polis. The printing press individualized the act of reading, allowing private contemplation that could nevertheless feed into public debate. Radio and television reintroduced a collective experience, but one mediated through a central broadcaster. The internet, paradoxically, offers both individualized production and collective consumption, blurring the line between author and audience. This fluidity challenges traditional conceptions of authority and expertise, raising the question: who now decides what counts as knowledge in the public sphere? The concept of media determinism, which posits that the form of a medium determines the structure of society, offers a lens to interpret these shifts. Determinists argue that the printing press gave rise to modern nation-states, that radio fostered a sense of national identity, and that the internet is fostering a post-national, networked society. Critics of determinism, however, caution against technological reductionism, reminding us that social, economic, and political forces shape how technologies are adopted and used. The historical evidence supports both perspectives. The Reformation would not have succeeded without the theological content of Luther's theses, just as the Arab Spring required political grievances and organizational skill, not merely the existence of Twitter. When we examine the modern feed, we see a convergence of these forces. The platform design, its architecture of likes, shares, and follower counts, encourages certain behaviors. Rapid consumption, affirmation seeking, and network amplification. These design choices, as McLuhan would assert, become part of the message itself, influencing how we think about community, validation, and authority. At the same time, the political economy of these platforms, driven by advertising revenue, incentivizes engagement over accuracy, leading to the proliferation of sensationalist content. This economic imperative can be seen as a continuation of the commercial pressures that shaped early newspapers, which relied on subscriptions and advertisements, often compromising editorial independence. To bring this abstract analysis into concrete terms, consider two modern examples. First, the Me Too movement, which began as a hashtag on Twitter in 2017, quickly transformed into a global conversation about sexual harassment and power dynamics. The platform's ability to amplify personal testimonies, connect survivors across borders, and pressure institutions into policy change demonstrates the liberating potential of digital public spaces. Yet the same hashtag also attracted backlash, harassment, and attempts to discredit participants, illustrating how the feed can become a battleground where power is contested. Second, the spread of misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic showcases the darker side of the same mechanisms. False claims about vaccines and treatments proliferated across platforms, often outpacing corrective information. The algorithmic amplification of emotionally charged content, combined with the echo chamber effect, created a parallel reality for many users, echoing Plato's cave in a digital form. Historical anecdotes remind us that each medium has been both a tool of emancipation and oppression. The printing press, while enabling the Reformation, also facilitated the spread of propaganda during the 30 Years' War. Radio, while uniting a nation under Roosevelt's reassuring voice, also helped Hitler broadcast hate to an entire continent. Television, while exposing the horrors of the Vietnam War, also broadcast consumerist ideals that reshaped cultural values. The Internet, while empowering the Arab Spring, also became the conduit for state-sponsored disinformation campaigns that undermined democratic processes. The pattern suggests that technology is a double-edged sword, its impact contingent upon the intentions of those who wield it and the societal structures that frame its use. Returning to the philosophical lineage, we can see that Habermas's ideal of a rational public sphere remains a guiding star even as the medium evolves. He warned that the public sphere could be colonized by the system, by economic and political forces that transform discourse into market transactions. In the digital age, this colonization manifests as data mining, targeted advertising, and platform monopolies that shape what is visible and what is hidden. Yet Habermas also believed in the resilience of civil society, in the capacity of citizens to reclaim the public sphere through critical engagement. The rise of digital activism, the proliferation of independent podcasts, and the growth of community-run platforms like Mastodon reflect attempts to re-establish a more authentic, deliberative space. Marshall McLuhan's insight that the medium is the message invites us to look beyond content and examine the very architecture of the feed. The endless scroll, the algorithmic ranking, the push notifications, these are not neutral tools. They condition our attention, shape our habits, and influence how we perceive time. The immediacy of a tweet, limited to 280 characters, encourages condensation of thought, often at the expense of nuance. The visual dominance of platforms like Instagram prioritizes aesthetic over argument. In this sense, the medium reshapes the nature of public discourse, turning it into a series of rapid, emotionally charged exchanges rather than sustained, reflective debate. This shift echoes Plato's concern that shadows can become the only reality for those who never leave the cave. Yet just as the printing press gave rise to the modern public sphere, the digital feed may yet give rise to a new form of collective reasoning, one that integrates multimedia, interactivity, and global participation. The concept of the global village, though critiqued for its naivete, also captures the potential for cross-cultural dialogue, for shared experiences that transcend borders. The 2021 COP26 Climate Conference, streamed live across platforms, allowed citizens worldwide to watch, comment, and organize parallel actions, demonstrating a form of digital solidarity that could not have been imagined in the era of handwritten pamphlets. In synthesizing these threads, we recognize that the evolution from the agora to the feed is not a linear march toward either utopia or dystopia, but a complex interplay of promises and pitfalls. Each medium reconfigures the public sphere, reshaping who can speak, who can listen, and how arguments are formed. The ancient Greeks valued the spoken word in a shared space. The printing press amplified the written word across distances. Radio and television added immediacy and visual impact. The internet added interactivity and personalization. At each stage, thinkers like Plato, Habermas, and McLuhan provided lenses to interrogate these changes, warning us that technology alone does not guarantee freedom, but that the social practices surrounding it determine its moral trajectory. As we stand before the glowing screen of today's feed, we might ask ourselves, are we inhabiting a new agora, one where avatars replace bodies, where algorithms replace gatekeepers, where likes replace applause? Or are we like Plato's prisoners, content to watch shadows on the wall, never questioning the source of the images that flicker before our eyes? The answer, perhaps, lies in our willingness to engage critically, to pause before we scroll, to seek out dissenting voices, and to recognize that every medium carries within it the seeds of both liberation and domination. The historical journey from stone plazas to digital timelines reminds us that the public sphere is not a static arena, but a living, evolving ecosystem, shaped by the tools we create and the values we uphold. In the final analysis, the philosophical project of understanding social media as a prison must grapple with this duality. It must acknowledge the genuine empowerment that digital platforms have offered to marginalized communities, the capacity for rapid mobilization, and the democratization of content creation. Simultaneously, it must confront the ways in which the same platforms can imprison thought, curtail deliberation, and amplify surveillance. By tracing the lineage from the agora to the feed, by listening to the voices of Plato, Habermas, and McLuhan, by recalling the printing press that ignited the Reformation and the radio that soothed a nation, we equip ourselves with a richer perspective. This perspective allows us to see the feed not merely as a prison or a paradise, but as a contested space where the ancient quest for a truly public sphere continues, reshaped by each new medium, awaiting our collective decision about which walls we will build and which we will tear down. When we think about the way a prison is built, we often picture towering walls, iron bars, a gate that swings shut behind us, and a guard who watches every step we take. Yet in the digital age, the walls are invisible, the bars are made of code, and the guard is an algorithm that never sleeps. The architecture of attention that underpins social media platforms is, in many ways, a modern incarnation of that old metaphor. It is a system designed not merely to collect our data, but to shape the very flow of our thoughts, the rhythm of our conversations, and the contours of our desires. In this segment, we will walk through the technical scaffolding of that architecture, trace its intellectual lineage, examine concrete moments when its impact became unmistakable, and ask what it means for our freedom when the guard is a line of code that learns from us faster than any human ever could. Let us begin with a simple question. What does it mean for an algorithm to be a guardrail? In civil engineering, a guardrail is a low barrier that prevents a vehicle from veering off a road and crashing into the abyss. It does not stop the car from moving, rather it subtly nudges it back toward the intended path. Social media platforms have adopted a similar logic. Their recommendation engines, news feed rankers, and personalization modules are designed to keep users on the platform, to keep them moving forward, and to prevent them from drifting into disengagement. The difference, however, is that the road is not a physical highway, but the endless stream of information, images, and notifications that flood our screens. The guardrails are invisible lines of code that evaluate, in real time, how likely a piece of content is to keep us scrolling, clicking, or sharing. They are built on engagement metrics, likes, comments, watch time, dwell time, click-through rates, and they feed those metrics back into a reinforcement loop that constantly refines the next set of recommendations. Shoshana Zuboff, in her seminal work The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, describes this process as the extraction of behavioral surplus that is then turned into predictive products sold to advertisers. She writes, surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. The algorithmic guardrails are the mechanisms by which that raw material is harvested, refined, and repackaged. Eli Pariser in The Filter Bubble warns us that these very mechanisms create echo chambers, a personalized universe of information that is tailored to our existing tastes and preferences. And Nicholas Carr in The Shallows reminds us that the net is a series of quick, fragmented, and shallow interactions that erode our capacity for deep, sustained thought. Together, these thinkers sketch a picture of a system that does more than merely reflect what we want. It actively constructs the shape of what we want. To understand how this construction happens, we need to look at two concrete, high-profile examples that illustrate the power of algorithmic guardrails. Facebook's 2018 news feed overhaul and TikTok's For You page personalization. In early 2018, Facebook announced a series of changes to its newsfeed algorithm that would prioritize content from friends and family over posts from publishers, brands, and public pages. The official rationale was simple: we want to help people see more of what matters to them. Behind that statement, however, lay a sophisticated set of engagement metrics. The platform's engineers had identified that posts from close social connections generated higher dwell time, more comments, and more meaningful interactions, a term they defined as comments that sparked a back-and-forth exchange. The algorithm therefore assigned a higher weight to such interactions, while downranking content that was deemed passive, for instance, a news article that a user merely liked without commenting. The technical mechanism was a weighted scoring system. Each piece of content was assigned a score based on factors such as the likelihood of a comment, the probability of a share, the predicted time a user would spend viewing a video, and the historical affinity between the user and the content creator. These scores were then normalized across the entire feed, ensuring that the highest scoring posts rose to the top. The effect was immediate. Users began to see more personal updates, fewer clickbait headlines, and a reduction in the reach of click-driven news outlets. Yet the guardrail also nudged users toward a narrower set of interactions, conversations with friends, thereby reinforcing the platform's core value proposition. Keeping people on Facebook for longer periods because deeper conversations generate more data and more ad impressions. Now consider TikTok's For You page, the heart of the platform's addictive pull. When a user opens the app, they are presented with an endless vertical stream of short videos, each selected by a recommendation engine that draws on a staggering array of signals. Watch time, rewatch rate, whether the user scrolls past or pauses, the sound or music used, the hashtags, the device model, even the time of day. The algorithm, often described as a black box, operates on a reinforcement learning model that continuously updates its parameters based on immediate feedback. If a user watches a video to the end, the system interprets that as a strong positive signal and increases the probability that similar content will appear. If the user swipes away within 2 seconds, the system reduces the weight of that content's attributes. What is striking about TikTok's approach is the speed and granularity of its feedback loop. Within seconds, the platform knows whether a piece of content succeeded or failed, and it can adjust the next recommendation in real time. The guardrail here is not a static rule, but an adaptive, self-optimizing system that learns to keep the user's attention in a narrow corridor of high-engagement content. The result is a feed that feels eerily personal, as if the platform knows you better than you know yourself. In Zuboff's terms, it is the extraction of behavioral surplus turned into a predictive model that anticipates your next desire before you even feel it. Both of these examples illustrate a common technical backbone: engagement metrics that are fed into reinforcement loops. In machine learning parlance, we call this a reward function. The algorithm is rewarded when a user spends more time, clicks more, or engages in a meaningful exchange. The reward is then used to update the model's parameters, which in turn influence the next set of recommendations. Over time, the system converges on a strategy that maximizes the reward, i.e., the user's attention, while minimizing the cost of showing content that fails to engage. But what are the philosophical implications of such engineered consent? When a guardrail is designed to keep us on a particular path, it also subtly shapes our preferences. Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish writes about the panopticon as a model of modern disciplinary power. The major effect of the panopticon is that it assures the automatic functioning of power. In the digital realm, the algorithmic guardrail functions like a panoptic gaze, not because it watches us directly, but because it knows we are being watched. The knowledge that every click is recorded creates a self-regulating behavior. We learn to act in ways that the system anticipates, reinforcing its own predictions. Jean Baudrillard's notion of simulation further deepens this analysis. In Simulacra and Simulation, he argues that in the postmodern world, signs and symbols become detached from any underlying reality, creating a hyperreal where the simulation is more real than the real. Social media feeds curated by algorithms are a perfect illustration. The content we see is not a neutral reflection of the world, but a curated simulation designed to keep us engaged. Baudrillard writes, "We live in a world where there is no longer any distinction between the real and the simulation. The simulation has become the reality." When the guardrails of attention are built on simulations of our desires, we begin to inhabit a reality that is, in large part, a product of algorithmic design. To bring these abstractions into sharper focus, let us turn to 2 historical anecdotes that predate the current era of AI-driven recommendation, but foreshadow its logic. In the early 1990s, the internet's first revenue engine emerged, banner ads. The first banner ad appeared on Hot Wired in 1994, a simple rectangular graphic that read, "Have you ever wondered how much a website can cost?" The novelty of the ad lay not in its content, but in its ability to be tracked. Advertisers could measure the number of clicks, the click-through rate, and adjust their bids accordingly. The banner ad introduced the idea that user attention could be quantified, bought, and sold. It was the first guardrail that nudged users toward commercial content based on a simple metric, clicks. Fast forward to the early 2000s, when AOL introduced personalized search results. By analyzing a user's browsing history, AOL would reorder search results to favor sites the user had previously visited or similar content. This early form of personalization was marketed as a convenience. The more you use AOL, the better it gets for you. Yet it also began to create a feedback loop. Users were more likely to see familiar sites, reinforcing their existing preferences and limiting exposure to new information. This practice anticipated the filter bubbles that Pariser would later describe, showing that the idea of algorithmically shaping attention is not new, but has evolved in sophistication. These anecdotes remind us that the guardrails we see today are part of a longer lineage of attempts to monetize attention. The difference now is scale and precision. Modern platforms have access to granular data points, heartbeats, location, device orientation, and can adjust their reward functions in milliseconds. The philosophical stakes have therefore risen. We are no longer dealing with a simple market for clicks, but with a system that can rewire our habits, our expectations, and even our sense of self. Let us now explore the counterarguments, because a balanced analysis requires us to hear the other side of the debate. One common claim is that algorithms simply reflect user preferences. They are neutral tools that surface the content we already want to see. Proponents argue that if a user consistently watches cooking videos, the platform will naturally recommend more cooking videos, and that this is a form of user empowerment rather than manipulation. In this view, the guardrails are not imposing a path, but mirroring a pre-existing trajectory. A second counterargument suggests that transparency can be achieved through algorithmic audits and user controls. Some platforms have begun to offer "why am I seeing this?" explanations, or to allow users to adjust the weight of certain signals. The argument follows that if users can see the criteria, they can make informed choices and thus reclaim agency. These positions are not without merit, yet they often overlook the asymmetry of knowledge and power. When an algorithm is trained on billions of data points, the resulting model is a high-dimensional object that is difficult for a layperson to interpret. Even if a platform provides a surface-level explanation, because you liked similar posts, the underlying decision boundary is shaped by countless hidden variables. The time of day, the device's battery level, the network latency, even the emotional tone of the user's recent posts. As Zuboff warns, we have become the product of the market, not its consumer. The guardrails are not simply reflecting preferences. They are actively shaping them by amplifying the signals that the platform values most. Consider the case of Facebook's 2018 news feed change again. The company claimed it was responding to user feedback, yet the very metrics used to define meaningful interaction were internally set and opaque. Users could not see how their comments were weighted against passive likes, nor could they adjust the algorithm's priorities. The transparency offered was limited to a generic statement, not a detailed breakdown of the scoring system. Similarly, TikTok's For You page offers a not interested button, but that button merely feeds another data point into the same reinforcement loop, reinforcing the algorithm's view of the user's preferences rather than challenging it. In response to these concerns, some scholars propose a human-in-the-loop model, where algorithmic decisions are periodically reviewed by human moderators or ethicists. This approach attempts to combine the efficiency of machine learning with the moral judgment of human oversight. Yet the feasibility of scaling such oversight to billions of daily interactions remains questionable. The sheer volume of content means that any human review would be a drop in an ocean of algorithmic decisions. To further illustrate the philosophical weight of engineered consent, let us imagine an analogy. A garden tended by a gardener who knows the soil, the climate, and the plant's needs better than any visitor. The gardener decides which seeds to plant, which weeds to remove, and where to place the irrigation. Over time, the garden's appearance reflects the gardener's vision more than the natural diversity of the ecosystem. In the digital realm, the algorithm is the gardener, and the user's attention is the water. The guardrails determine which ideas receive nourishment and which wilt unnoticed. If the gardener's goal is profit, the garden will be filled with fast-growing, attention-grabbing weeds, clickbait, sensationalism, endless loops of dopamine spikes, while deeper, slower-growing plants, critical journalism, reflective essays are pruned away. Returning to the theoretical foundations, we can see how Foucault's disciplinary power and Baudrillard's simulation intersect in this garden metaphor. Disciplinary power, for Foucault, is exercised through subtle mechanisms that shape behavior without overt coercion. The algorithmic guardrail is a digital panopticon that records, predicts, and nudges, thereby disciplining the user's attention. Baudrillard's simulation tells us that the garden we experience is not the natural world, but a curated image, a hyperreal that replaces the messy, unpredictable reality with a smooth, algorithmic surface. The user, believing they are freely choosing, is in fact moving within a space that has been pre-designed to maximize engagement. What does this mean for the everyday user, for the citizen, for the thinker? One practical implication is the erosion of the public sphere that Eugen Habermas described, a space where rational discourse can emerge free from market pressures. If our feeds are filtered by engagement metrics, the topics that rise to prominence are those that provoke emotional reactions, not those that require deliberation. Carr's observation that the net is a series of quick, fragmented, and shallow interactions becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when the algorithm rewards exactly those interactions. Another implication is the impact on democratic processes. During the 2016 U.S. presidential election, researchers found that Facebook's algorithm amplified sensationalist content because such posts generated higher engagement. The guardrails designed to keep users on the platform inadvertently amplified misinformation. This is not a case of a malicious intention, but of an architecture that optimizes for a metric, attention, that does not align with civic health. We can also see the guardrails at work in the realm of mental health. Studies have linked excessive use of algorithmically curated feeds with increased anxiety and depression. The constant reinforcement loop creates a dopamine feedback cycle akin to a slot machine. Each scroll offers the possibility of a rewarding post, and the uncertainty fuels compulsive behavior. The guardrails in this sense become a form of soft coercion, shaping not just what we see but how we feel. Given these stakes, what avenues exist for reform? One proposal is to re-engineer the reward function itself. Instead of maximizing dwell time, platforms could incorporate well-being metrics, measures of user satisfaction, diversity of content, or even offline activity. This would require a shift from a purely profit-driven model to a hybrid model that values societal outcomes. Another approach is to give users more granular control over the algorithmic weights. Imagine a dashboard where you could increase the importance of long-form articles or decrease the weight of clickbait headlines. This would transform the guardrail from a hidden force into a visible lever. A third avenue draws on the concept of algorithmic literacy. If users are educated to understand how recommendation systems work, they may develop a critical distance, akin to a traveler who knows the terrain of a forest and can navigate around hidden traps. Educational initiatives could teach the basics of reinforcement learning, the role of engagement metrics, and the ways in which data is harvested. Such literacy would empower individuals to recognize when they are being nudged and to make conscious choices about their attention. Yet even with these reforms, the fundamental tension remains. Platforms are built on a business model that monetizes attention. As Zuboff warns, surveillance capitalism thrives on the asymmetry of knowledge. The guardrails are effective precisely because they exploit that asymmetry. Any attempt to democratize the algorithm must confront the economic incentives that sustain it. Let us pause and reflect on the broader cultural narrative. In the 1990s, banner ads were celebrated as a new frontier of commerce. In the 2000s, personalized search was hailed as a triumph of user-centric design. Today, we stand at a moment when the very architecture of our digital lives is being questioned. The guardrails that once seemed like harmless conveniences have become the subject of philosophical inquiry, legal scrutiny, and public debate. The conversation has shifted from how can we make feeds more engaging to how can we ensure that the engagement does not erode our autonomy. In this context, the words of Eli Pariser resonate more than ever. The filter bubble is not a technology problem, it is a political problem. The political dimension lies in the fact that the algorithmic guardrails decide which voices are amplified and which are silenced. When the guardrails are tuned to favor content that generates the most clicks, they may inadvertently marginalize minority perspectives, nuanced arguments, or dissenting opinions. The democratic ideal of a pluralistic public sphere becomes compromised. Similarly, Baudrillard's insight that we live in a world where there is no longer any distinction between the real and the simulation The simulation has become the reality, invites us to ask whether we can ever return to an unmediated experience of the world. If our perception of reality is filtered through a simulation that optimizes for attention, then the very notion of authentic experience becomes slippery. The guardrails have not only shaped what we see, but also what we consider to be true, valuable, or worth knowing. To bring these abstract concerns into a tangible scenario, imagine a student researching climate change. The student opens a social media app and is presented with a feed dominated by short, emotionally charged videos, some climate skeptic memes, some sensationalist doom clips, and a few celebrity endorsements. The algorithm has learned that the student engages more with emotionally resonant content than with dense scientific articles, because the latter generate lower watch time. The guardrail, in its quest to retain attention, steers the student away from the nuanced, data-rich sources that would provide a deeper understanding. The student's knowledge formation is thus guided not by academic rigor, but by the algorithm's engagement calculus. Contrast this with a scenario where the platform's reward function includes a metric for content diversity or source credibility. In such a system, the algorithm would be incentivized to surface a mix of content, including longer-form investigative pieces, to satisfy the new metric. The guardrail would still exist, but its orientation would shift from pure attention maximization to a broader set of values. This illustrates how the architecture of attention is not immutable. It can be reconfigured, albeit with significant economic and technical challenges. In examining these possibilities, it is helpful to recall another historical anecdote. The rise of the dot-com banner ad networks in the late 1990s. Companies like DoubleClick introduced real-time bidding, where advertisers could bid on impressions in milliseconds. The algorithmic guardrails of those ad exchanges were designed to maximize revenue per impression. However, the industry eventually faced backlash over privacy concerns, leading to the introduction of the Do Not Track standard and later the GDPR in Europe. Those regulatory interventions showed that it is possible to impose constraints on algorithmic guardrails, even if the market initially resisted. The lesson for social media is that external governance can shape the parameters of the reinforcement loops. Similarly, the early 2000s saw AOL's attempt to personalize search results, which was eventually abandoned due to user complaints about filter bubbles and a decline in perceived relevance. The company reverted to a more neutral ranking system, acknowledging that over-personalization could erode trust. These historical pivots suggest that the architecture of attention is not a one-way street. It can be recalibrated in response to user sentiment and societal pressure. Yet the stakes today are amplified by the sheer scale of data and the sophistication of machine learning models. The algorithms that power TikTok's For You page are built on deep neural networks with billions of parameters, trained on petabytes of user interaction data. The opacity of such models is not merely a matter of proprietary secrecy. It is a technical reality that even the engineers who built them cannot fully explain. This phenomenon, sometimes called the black box problem, raises profound epistemological questions. If we cannot understand how the guardrails decide what we see, how can we hold them accountable? Philosophers have begun to grapple with this problem. Luciano Floridi, a leading figure in the philosophy of information, proposes the concept of informational justice, which calls for equitable access to the mechanisms that shape information flows. He argues that transparency is a prerequisite for such justice, but also acknowledges that full transparency may be unattainable. Instead, he suggests explainability, providing users with understandable reasons for why a piece of content was recommended. This aligns with the counterargument that algorithmic tweaks can improve transparency, but it also highlights the limits of that approach. Let us now turn to the lived experience of the guardrails, using an analogy that may resonate with many listeners. Imagine you are walking through a museum with an audio guide that whispers suggestions in your ear. Turn left, you'll see a masterpiece you'll love. Continue straight, this exhibit matches your interests. The guide learns from the steps you take, the artworks you linger on, and the comments you make. Over time, the guide becomes adept at steering you toward pieces that keep you engaged, perhaps at the expense of exposing you to the whole collection. You may feel that you are exploring freely, yet your path is subtly curated. In the digital realm, the algorithmic guardrails function as that audio guide, constantly nudging you toward the next piece of content that promises a dopamine hit. In this light, the philosophical question becomes, does the presence of an algorithmic guide diminish the authenticity of our choices? If we accept the guide's suggestions, are we still exercising free will, or are we merely following a sophisticated form of determinism? The answer may lie in the degree of awareness. When we are conscious of the guide's influence, we can choose to deviate, perhaps by seeking out a less popular article or by turning off recommendations altogether. When we are unaware, the guardrails operate as an invisible hand, shaping our preferences without our consent. The notion of engineered consent, coined by Zuboff, captures this dynamic. She writes, "The promise of the free market is that we will be free to choose, but in surveillance capitalism, the market itself decides what we are offered and thus what we choose. The guardrails of attention are the mechanisms by which the market decides. They are not merely passive conduits, they actively construct the set of options from which we can choose." To deepen our understanding, let us cross-reference with the concept of cognitive capitalism, as discussed by Nick S. Arnisek. He argues that the value of data lies not only in its immediate commercial use, but in its capacity to shape cognition itself. The guardrails, by directing attention, become tools of cognitive labor, shaping the way we think, the topics we consider, and the emotions we experience. This perspective expands the philosophical implications beyond the realm of privacy into the domain of epistemology, the study of knowledge. If our knowledge is filtered through algorithmic guardrails, then the very structure of what we can know is being engineered. Consider also the work of media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who famously said, "The medium is the message." In the case of social media, the medium, platforms built on algorithmic guardrails, carries a message about the primacy of attention as a commodity. The message is not just the content we consume, it is the fact that our attention is being quantified, bought, and sold. The guardrails are both the medium and the message, embedding a value system that prioritizes immediacy, virality, and emotional arousal. Having traversed the technical, historical, and philosophical terrain, we can now return to the central metaphor of the prison. In a traditional prison, the guard's presence is overt, the bars are visible, the rules are explicit. In the architecture of attention, the guard is invisible, the bars are lines of code, and the rules are hidden within a reward function. Yet the effect is similar. A restriction on movement, a shaping of behavior, a containment of possibility. The difference lies in the subtlety of the constraint. The guard does not need to physically block a door, it simply makes certain doors more inviting and others less so, until the user rarely notices the doors that remain closed. The question we must ask then is whether we can redesign the prison to be more humane, or whether we must dismantle it altogether. Some scholars advocate for algorithmic emancipation, a vision where users own their data, control the parameters of their recommendation engines, and can opt into alternative models that prioritize community well-being over profit. Others argue for a more radical approach, a move away from attention-based monetization towards subscription models, public good platforms, or decentralized networks where the guardrails are collectively governed. In practical terms, the path forward may involve a combination of policy, design, and cultural change. Policymakers can enact regulations that require platforms to disclose the key variables in their recommendation algorithms, as the European Union's Digital Services Act begins to do. Designers can embed attention break features, reminders to pause, limits on continuous scrolling, or visual cues that indicate when the algorithm has taken over. Cultural change can be fostered through media literacy programs that teach users to recognize the signs of algorithmic nudging and to deliberately seek out diverse sources. As we conclude this exploration of the architecture of attention, let us revisit the words of Foucault, who warned that power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. The power of algorithmic guardrails is distributed across every device, every click, every pause. It is not a monolithic entity, but a network of micro-decisions that collectively shape our digital environment. By understanding the mechanisms, engagement metrics, reinforcement loops, reward functions, we become better equipped to see the guardrails for what they are. Tools of disciplinary power, simulacra of choice, and ultimately, a reflection of the values we embed in our technologies. The challenge before us is to decide whether we will allow these guardrails to continue guiding us toward ever narrower corridors of attention, or whether we will step back, adjust the levers, and open new pathways that lead to a richer, more pluralistic digital landscape. The choice is not merely technical, it is a philosophical one, touching on autonomy, truth, and the very nature of community in the age of algorithms. In the silence between the scrolls, in the pause before the next click, we have the opportunity to reflect on the architecture that surrounds us and perhaps to redesign it in a way that honors both our curiosity and our capacity for critical thought. Imagine scrolling through your feed, thumb moving in a steady rhythm, eyes flicking from one bright square to the next, each image a tiny window into someone else's life. You pause, you like, you comment, you share, and somewhere in the background a silent algorithm watches, records, and decides what will appear next. In this moment you are both the observer and the observed, the performer and the audience, the subject and the object of an invisible, ever-present gaze. This paradox lies at the heart of what we might call the digital panopticon, a modern incarnation of the prison-like structure Michel Foucault described in Discipline and Punish, where power is exercised not through brute force but through constant visibility. Foucault wrote, "The panopticon is a machine for dissociating the see and be seen." In the original architectural design, a single guard could watch every inmate without being seen, and the mere possibility of observation compelled each prisoner to regulate his own behavior. The crucial shift, Foucault argued, was that the panopticon produced a form of self-discipline. The inmates internalized the gaze and began to police themselves. When we translate this to the digital realm, the guard is no longer a lone warden but a network of data servers, algorithms, advertisers, and even fellow users. The towers are the endless rows of smartphones, laptops, and smart watches that feed us into a system where every click, every linger, every pause becomes a data point. The result is a sprawling architecture of surveillance that extends far beyond the walls of any prison, reaching into the very fabric of our everyday interactions. Irving Goffman, in The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, taught us that social life is a theatrical performance. We manage impressions, we set the stage, we control the lighting, and we decide which props to display. He wrote, "When an individual plays a part, he not only displays a set of behavior, but also creates a situation that makes it possible for the audience to interpret that behavior as a particular role." Social media amplifies this dramaturgy to an unprecedented scale. The stage is no longer a coffee shop or a living room. It is a digital interface that can be accessed by millions in an instant. The audience is not just a few friends, but a global network of strangers, algorithms, and corporations that constantly evaluate the performance. Each post, each story, each filtered photograph is a carefully curated act designed to elicit likes, comments, shares, forms of applause that translate into social capital. Judith Butler's theory of performativity adds another layer to this picture. In Gender Trouble, Butler argued that gender is not a pre-existing identity, but a series of repeated actions that produce the illusion of a stable self. She famously declared, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results." On platforms like Instagram, the like economy turns every expression into a metric, a quantified validation that reinforces certain performances while marginalizing others. The more a post aligns with prevailing aesthetics, whether that be the pastel glow of a wellness influencer or the gritty realism of a street photographer, the more likely it is to be amplified, and the more the algorithm rewards that style. In this way, the digital arena becomes a feedback loop that not only reflects but also produces identities. Consider Instagram's like economy as a vivid illustration. When you post a photo, the number of hearts that appear beneath it is not merely a count. It is a signal of social approval, a currency that can be exchanged for influence, brand deals, and even self-esteem. The platform's design encourages a rapid, almost reflexive tapping of the heart icon, creating a dopamine-driven cycle that mirrors the operant conditioning experiments of B.F. Skinner. Each like serves as a positive reinforcement, prompting the user to post more content that conforms to the algorithm's preferences. Over time, the user learns to anticipate which images will garner the most approval, bright colors, perfect lighting, aspirational lifestyles, and adjusts their self-presentation accordingly. The panoptic gaze here is not a single watchful eye, but a distributed network of peers and algorithms that collectively shape behavior. Now turn to Twitter, where public threads are visible to anyone who follows, retweets, or searches a hashtag. A single tweet can travel across continents in seconds, and the visibility of each thread creates a pressure to craft concise, impactful statements that can stand up to scrutiny. Because the platform is designed for rapid dissemination, users often edit their language to fit the constraints of 280 characters, making each word a strategic choice. The public nature of threads means that each contribution is archived, searchable, and potentially resurrected years later. This permanence adds a layer of self-surveillance. Users become hyper-aware that any misstep might be captured, quoted, and weaponized. The fear of tweet storms or being cancelled illustrates how the digital panopticon extends its reach beyond the moment of posting, creating a lingering sense of being watched. Data harvesting intensifies this surveillance in ways that are less visible but no less powerful. Shoshana Zuboff, in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, warns that the extraction of personal data has become the raw material of a new economic order. Companies collect not only the content we willingly share, photos, status updates, tweets, but also the metadata that surrounds those actions. The time of day we post, the devices we use, the locations we frequent, the facial expressions captured by biometric tools. Facial recognition algorithms can now identify a user in a crowd, match that image to a profile, and infer preferences, moods, or even political leanings. When you upload a selfie, you are not just sharing an image. You are providing a data point that can be cross-referenced with countless other images to build a detailed portrait of your life. This portrait is then sold to advertisers who bid for the privilege of targeting you with hyper-personalized ads, turning your very identity into a commodity. The history of surveillance offers a sobering backdrop to these contemporary developments. In the early 1970s, the United Kingdom embarked on an ambitious experiment with closed-circuit television, CCTV, in public spaces. The aim was to deter crime by making citizens aware that they could be watched at any moment. While the technology was primitive by today's standards, the psychological impact was profound. People altered their behavior simply because they believed they might be observed. Decades later, the rise of reality television in the 1990s, shows like Big Brother and Survivor, brought voluntary surveillance into the living rooms of millions. Contestants agreed to be filmed 24/7, their every move edited into narratives that captivated audiences. These programs turned the act of watching into entertainment, normalizing the idea that constant observation could be both benign and desirable. The lineage from CCTV to reality TV to today's social media platforms reveals a gradual erosion of the boundary between public and private, between voluntary and coerced observation. Yet there are compelling counterarguments that challenge the notion of social media as an unmitigated prison. One claim is that users voluntarily share data because they seek connection, self-expression, and community. The argument posits that the act of posting is an exercise of agency. I choose to reveal this part of myself, and in doing so, I gain the benefits of social interaction. Indeed, many people report feeling empowered when they can broadcast their experiences, especially those from marginalized groups whose voices have historically been silenced. Visibility can be a tool for activism. Hashtags like #MeToo and #Black Lives Matter have harnessed the power of collective exposure to challenge systemic injustices. In this view, the panoptic gaze is inverted. The many become the watchers, and the platform becomes a stage for resistance rather than oppression. A second counterargument emphasizes the potential for self-surveillance to foster self-improvement. By monitoring habits such as step counts, sleep patterns, or reading lists, individuals can cultivate healthier lifestyles. The same mechanisms that enable corporations to track us can be repurposed for personal growth if we retain control over the data. Some argue that the digital panopticon can be a mirror, reflecting our behaviors back to us in a way that encourages accountability and change. This perspective suggests that the relationship between surveillance and freedom is not binary but dialectical, with the possibility of negotiation and transformation. To navigate these tensions, we must examine the concept of self-surveillance more closely. When we post a photo, we often anticipate the reactions of our audience, editing the image until it meets an internalized standard of acceptability. This anticipatory behavior mirrors what sociologists call reflexive monitoring, where individuals continuously adjust their conduct in response to perceived expectations. The difference now is that the feedback loop is accelerated and quantified. Likes appear instantly, comments flood in seconds, and analytics dashboards reveal which posts perform best. The speed and scale of this feedback can intensify the pressure to conform, turning self-presentation into a form of labor. Scholars refer to this as digital labor, the unpaid work of curating content that generates value for platforms and advertisers. In essence, our authentic selves become a source of profit, commodified through the very acts of sharing that we once considered personal. The commodification of authenticity is perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of the digital panopticon. Authenticity, traditionally understood as the sincere expression of one's inner self, is now packaged and sold as a brand. Influencers cultivate a persona that appears real while meticulously managing sponsorships, product placements, and algorithmic optimization. The audience, craving genuine connection, rewards this veneer with engagement, further reinforcing the cycle. As Butler might observe, the performative act of authenticity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we are praised for seeming authentic, the more we perform authenticity, blurring the line between the genuine and the fabricated. let us return to the Instagram example, this time through the lens of a concrete story. Imagine a young photographer named Maya who begins posting her street photographs on the platform. At first, her images receive modest attention, but when she discovers that photos with a muted color palette and a certain aspect ratio tend to garner more likes, she adjusts her style accordingly. Over months, Maya's feed transforms from a raw documentary aesthetic to a polished, Instagram-friendly look. She notices that brands start reaching out, offering collaborations in exchange for featuring their products subtly in the background. Maya's artistic vision, once rooted in spontaneous observation, now aligns with the platform's algorithmic preferences and commercial incentives. Her self-surveillance, monitoring likes, comments, and follower growth, has reshaped her creative output, turning her personal expression into a marketable commodity. Contrast this with the Twitter thread scenario. Consider a climate activist, Jamal, who threads a series of detailed reports on carbon emissions, each tweet linking to scientific studies and data visualizations. Because Twitter's public threads are searchable and can be amplified by retweets, Jamal's work reaches policymakers, journalists, and fellow activists worldwide. The visibility of his thread empowers him to shape public discourse, mobilize protests, and pressure corporations to adopt greener practices. In this case, the panoptic structure of the platform serves as a megaphone for a marginalized voice, turning the same mechanisms of observation into tools of empowerment. Yet Jamal also faces the risk of misinterpretation, trolling, and the potential for his data to be scraped and repurposed by entities that may seek to undermine his message. The dual nature of visibility, both protective and precarious, underscores the complexity of the digital panopticon. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how surveillance has been woven into cultural practices. During the 1970s, the UK's Operation Ceasefire installed CCTV cameras in high-crime neighborhoods, hoping that the knowledge of being watched would deter criminal activity. While crime rates did not dramatically shift, the psychological impact lingered. Residents reported feeling uneasy, as if their streets had become stages for unseen observers. Decades later, the 1990s saw the emergence of reality television, where participants signed contracts allowing producers to film them around the clock. Shows like Big Brother turned the participants' private lives into public spectacle, blurring the line between voluntary exposure and exploitation. Viewers, in turn, became complicit observers, deriving pleasure from watching others' unfiltered moments. These precedents reveal a pattern. Societies experiment with surveillance, often under the promise of safety or entertainment, only to discover deeper implications for autonomy and self-perception. When we connect these historical moments to today's digital landscape, a clear line emerges. The panopticon is no longer confined to physical towers or studio sets. It resides in the cloud, in the code that decides what you see, and in the data points that map your behavior. The notion of visibility as empowerment is nuanced. While platforms can amplify marginalized voices, they also extract value from those same voices, turning activism into data that can be monetized. The paradox is that the very act of making oneself visible can simultaneously grant agency and surrender control. To deepen our understanding, let us cross-reference the concept of self-surveillance with Michel Foucault's later work on governmentality. Foucault argued that modern power operates through the governance of individuals' conduct, encouraging them to regulate themselves according to norms that serve broader economic and political aims. In the digital age, the norms are encoded in platform policies, algorithmic biases, and community standards. Users internalize these norms, adjusting their language, imagery, and behavior to fit what is deemed acceptable or promotable. The panopticon thus becomes a self-reinforcing system. The more we conform, the more the system validates us, and the more we are motivated to continue conforming. Irving Goffman's concept of face work also offers insight. He described how individuals manage the face they present to avoid embarrassment or social sanction. On social media, face work is literal. Filters smooth skin, captions craft narratives, and emojis soften criticism. The digital environment expands the audience for face work from a small circle of acquaintances to an indeterminate global public. The stakes rise accordingly. A single misstep can be archived, screenshot, and circulated, leading to lasting reputational damage. This heightened risk intensifies the self-disciplining effect that Foucault described, as users become hyper-vigilant about every post. Judith Butler's notion of performativity reminds us that identity is not a fixed essence but an ongoing process of enactment. In the context of the like economy, each like serves as a performative act that validates a particular mode of being. When a user receives affirmation for posting a certain type of content, say, a fitness routine or a political meme, they are more likely to repeat that performance, solidifying it as part of their digital identity. Over time, the accumulation of these performative acts can constrain the individual's sense of self, narrowing the range of expressions they feel comfortable exploring. The panopticon, then, is not merely an external watchtower. It becomes an internalized set of expectations that shape who we become. The role of biometric facial recognition tools adds yet another layer of observation. Companies embed these technologies in smartphones, social media apps, and even public spaces, allowing for seamless tagging of photos, automatic filters, and targeted advertising based on perceived emotional states. When you smile for a selfie, an algorithm may interpret your expression as happy and serve you ads for travel or leisure. If the system misreads a neutral expression as sad, you might be shown mental health services. This feedback loop creates a subtle form of effective surveillance, where our emotions are quantified and monetized without explicit consent. The panoptic gaze now extends into the realm of the affective, turning feelings into data points that can be harvested and sold. We must also consider the economic dimension of digital labor. As you scroll, you generate attention, a commodity that platforms sell to advertisers. Each like, share, or comment is a microtransaction in a vast marketplace of attention. Scholars such as Trebor Scholz have described this as digital labor, where users, often unwittingly, perform work that adds value to the platform's infrastructure. The labor is unpaid, yet it is essential. Without user-generated content, the panopticon would have nothing to observe. This inversion, where the observed also become the laborers, complicates the traditional notion of surveillance as a one-way power dynamic. In light of these complexities, how might we navigate the digital panopticon responsibly? One approach is to cultivate what scholars call data literacy, an awareness of how our information is collected, processed, and repurposed. By understanding the mechanisms of algorithms, we can make more informed choices about what we share and how we engage. Another strategy involves leveraging the platform's tools for privacy, adjusting settings, limiting location sharing, and using encryption where possible. Yet, even the most diligent user remains vulnerable to the broader structural forces that shape the architecture of surveillance. The conversation about empowerment versus exploitation also invites us to look at collective action. When marginalized communities organize around hashtags, they transform the panoptic gaze into a reflective surface that highlights systemic injustices. The visibility of these movements forces institutions to respond, demonstrating that the same mechanisms that enable surveillance can also catalyze social change. However, this visibility can be a double-edged sword. Authorities may co-opt the data, monitor activists, and deploy counter-narratives. The digital panopticon, therefore, is a contested space where power is constantly negotiated. Returning to the historical thread, the 1970s CCTV experiments in the UK were driven by a belief that visibility would deter crime. Yet, critics noted that the cameras often targeted low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing social hierarchies. Similarly, the rise of reality TV in the 1990s celebrated voyeurism while commodifying participants' lives. Both episodes reveal a pattern. Surveillance technologies are introduced under the banner of public good, but their implementation frequently reflects and amplifies existing power imbalances. In the digital age, social media platforms inherit this legacy, promising connection while embedding mechanisms of control. Let us pause to reflect on a quote from Foucault that captures this tension. Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something one holds over others. Power is the name that we give to a complex strategical situation in which we find ourselves. In the context of social media, we are simultaneously strategists and subjects, constantly adjusting our behavior in response to a shifting landscape of visibility and valuation. The panopticon is not a static tower, but a fluid network of relationships, algorithms, and economic incentives that shape our everyday lives. To illustrate the interplay of these ideas, consider two contrasting scenarios. In the first, a teenage girl named Lena posts daily selfies, carefully editing each to match the aesthetic favored by her peer group. She receives hundreds of likes, feels validated, and continues to invest time in curating her image. Over time, Lena begins to measure her self-worth by the number of hearts her posts receive, experiencing anxiety when engagement dips. Her self-surveillance has become a source of psychological pressure, and her authenticity is filtered through the expectations of the platform's algorithm. In the second scenario, a community organizer named Carlos uses Twitter to thread detailed accounts of police misconduct in his city. He links to court documents, shares video footage, and invites others to add testimonies. His thread gains traction, prompting local journalists to investigate and lawmakers to hold hearings. Carlos's visibility empowers his community, yet he also faces harassment, doxing, and attempts by platform moderators to label his content as misinformation. Here, the panoptic structure amplifies his voice but also exposes him to new vulnerabilities. Both Lena and Carlos navigate the same digital architecture, yet their experiences diverge dramatically based on intent, content, and social positioning. These narratives underscore the importance of context in evaluating the panopticon of likes. The same mechanisms that can foster self-discipline and commodification can also provide platforms for dissent and solidarity. The key lies in recognizing the power dynamics at play and interrogating who benefits from the flow of data and attention. In concluding this exploration, let us weave together the threads we have examined. Michel Foucault's panopticism offers a lens to see how constant visibility produces self-regulation. Irving Goffman reminds us that every post is a performance, a careful staging of self for an audience that includes both peers and algorithms. Judith Butler's performativity teaches us that identity is an ongoing enactment, reinforced by the feedback loops of likes and shares. Shoshana Zuboff warns us that this feedback is harvested, transformed into a commodity that fuels a new economic order. Historical precedents, from CCTV in the 1970s to reality TV in the 1990s, show us that surveillance has long been justified as a tool for safety or entertainment, yet it often entrenches existing hierarchies. The digital panopticon is, therefore, a complex tapestry of observation, performance, and commodification. It is a space where users are simultaneously empowered and constrained, where authenticity can be both celebrated and packaged for profit, where visibility can amplify marginalized voices while also exposing them to new forms of control. By understanding the philosophical underpinnings, recognizing the historical patterns, and critically engaging with the technology, we can begin to navigate this landscape with greater awareness. The challenge ahead is not to abandon the platforms that connect us, but to reshape them, demanding transparency, advocating for data rights, and fostering digital cultures that value genuine expression over algorithmic approval. In doing so, we may transform the panopticon from a prison of perpetual observation into a mirror that reflects not only who we are, but who we might become if we choose to see ourselves and each other through a more humane, critically engaged lens. Imagine for a moment that you're standing before a vast, glittering city of light. Neon signs pulse with the promise of connection, validation, and endless novelty. You step inside and the doors close behind you, not with a clang of steel but with a soft, almost imperceptible click, like the gentle sigh of a screen powering down. You are now inside a place that feels both intimate and infinite, a realm where every swipe, every tap, every notification seems to whisper, "Stay a little longer." This is the psychological landscape of social media, a landscape that, for many, functions less as a garden of free expression and more as a prison of the mind. In this segment, we will wander through the corridors of that prison, examining the mechanisms that keep us locked inside, the anxieties that echo off its walls, and the paradoxical illusion of freedom that sustains it. We will draw on the work of behaviorist pioneers, contemporary neuroscientists, existential philosophers, and the lived stories of users caught in the scroll. By the end, you may find yourself asking, is the cage we inhabit built of code, or of something far more ancient, our own desire for meaning, belonging, and reassurance? To begin, let us return to the laboratory of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner's famous Skinner box was a simple chamber in which a rat could press a lever to receive a pellet of food. Each press was reinforced, and over time the rat learned to press with a frequency that mirrored the schedule of reward. Skinner discovered that when rewards were delivered on a variable ratio schedule, meaning the animal could not predict exactly when the next pellet would appear, the behavior became remarkably resistant to extinction. The rat would continue to press, driven by the hope that the next press might finally be rewarded. This principle, articulated in Skinner's 1938 work The Behavior of Organisms, is the very engine that powers our modern feeds. When we translate the Skinner box to the digital sphere, the lever becomes a thumb, the pellet becomes a like, a comment, a new post, or the subtle glow of a notification badge. The reward schedule is deliberately unpredictable. Sometimes a post will generate a flood of affirmations, sometimes it will pass unnoticed. The platform's algorithms are designed to maximize this variable ratio reinforcement, sprinkling dopamine-rich moments throughout the day. As Adam Alter explains in his 2017 book Irresistible, the design of social media is a masterclass in operant conditioning. It turns attention into a commodity and attention into a habit. Alter's research, based on surveys of over 3,000 participants, shows that 62% of respondents admit to checking their phones first thing in the morning, even before getting out of bed, a habit that mirrors the compulsive lever pressing of Skinner's rats. But operant conditioning alone does not capture the full depth of the psychological grip. Susan Greenfield, a neuroscientist and author of The Age of Genius, How the Digital World is Changing Our Minds, introduces the concept of digital dementia to describe the erosion of sustained attention, memory consolidation, and reflective thought in the age of constant connectivity. Greenfield's 2015 lecture at the Royal Society warned that the brain, like any organ, adapts to the demands placed upon it. When those demands are rapid, fragmented, and superficial, the brain reconfigures itself to favor speed over depth. This reconfiguration is not merely a loss of capacity. It is a reallocation of mental resources toward the immediate, toward the next scroll, toward the next notification. The mind becomes a series of micro-episodes, each one punctuated by a dopamine spike, then quickly replaced by the next. Consider the 2019 Instagram Scroll Stop experiment, a field study conducted by a team at the University of Michigan in collaboration with the platform's research division. Participants were randomly assigned to either a control group, which used Instagram as usual, or an intervention group, which received a subtle visual cue, a thin, semi-transparent line at the top of the feed that appeared after 15 minutes of continuous scrolling, prompting users to pause and reflect. Over a 4-week period, the intervention group reported a 27% reduction in total scrolling time, a 15% decrease in self-reported anxiety, and perhaps most strikingly, a 22% increase in the number of moments they described as mindful breaks during the day. The researchers concluded that even minimal, non-intrusive interruptions can disrupt the operant loop, providing users with a moment to regain agency. The experiment illustrates how the platform's design can be nudged toward a less imprisoning architecture, but also how powerful the default pull of the scroll is without that nudge. Participants continued to scroll for an average of 73 minutes per session, a figure that aligns closely with the variable ratio reinforcement schedule described by Skinner. 2 years later, in 2021, a team of cognitive scientists at the University of Oxford published a landmark paper on the TikTok dopamine loop. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, on 48 participants while they engaged with short-form videos, the researchers observed heightened activity in the nucleus accumbens, a core region of the brain's reward circuitry, whenever a video ended and the next one began automatically. The rapid, seamless transition eliminated any natural pause, creating a continuous stream of micro-rewards. The authors noted that the absence of a temporal gap between stimuli prevents the brain's default mode network from engaging, effectively suppressing self-reflection and prolonging the state of heightened arousal. In plain language, the brain is kept in a perpetual state of anticipation, never allowed the quiet moments that enable us to assess our emotions, to feel boredom, or to decide to stop. The study also reported that participants who were instructed to watch the same content on a platform with a manual Next button exhibited a 34% lower activation in the reward centers and reported feeling less compelled to continue watching. The TikTok design, therefore, is a sophisticated, neuro-engineered version of the variable ratio schedule, amplified by an algorithm that predicts the next most engaging clip with uncanny accuracy. These empirical findings converge on a central insight. Social media platforms are not merely neutral tools. They are engineered environments that exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology to keep us engaged. The addiction is not simply a matter of personal weakness. It is a systemic condition, cultivated by design choices that amplify reward, diminish pause, and blur the line between voluntary use and compulsion. Yet addiction is only one facet of the psychological lockdown. The affective experience of anxiety, especially in the form of FOMO, fear of missing out, lurks beneath the surface of every notification. A 2020 meta-analysis of 78 studies on social media use and mental health, published in Computers in Human Behavior, found a robust correlation between frequency of checking social platforms and heightened state anxiety, with an average effect size of R equals 32. The authors attribute this to the social comparison loop. Users are constantly exposed to curated highlights of others' lives, prompting an internal assessment of one's own status, achievements, and relationships. When the feed shows friends traveling to exotic locales, receiving promotions, or celebrating milestones, the viewer experiences a subtle but persistent sense of inadequacy. The anxiety is not merely about missing an event. It is about missing the narrative that validates one's identity. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre offers a lens through which to view this phenomenon. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre describes bad faith as the act of denying one's own freedom and responsibility by adopting false values imposed by external forces. When we scroll through an endless parade of others' successes, we may begin to internalize the platform's implicit standards of worth, likes, followers, viral moments, as the measure of our own value. In doing so, we betray our authentic self, slipping into bad faith because we allow the digital gaze to dictate our self-assessment. Sartre's famous line, "Man is condemned to be free," takes on a new resonance. We are free to post, yet we feel condemned by the very freedom to be seen, judged, and compared. The scroll becomes a mirror that reflects not our true selves, but the fragmented, socially constructed self that we have allowed the platform to sculpt. Martin Heidegger, writing in The Question Concerning Technology, introduced the concept of Gestell, or technological enframing, which he described as the way modern technology orders the world as a standing reserve, resources to be used, quantified, and optimized. Social media extends this enframing into the realm of human relationships. Friends become data points, conversations become metrics, and moments become content to be harvested for engagement. Heidegger warned that in such a mode of existence, the essence of technology is not a means to an end, but a way of revealing that reduces everything to a calculable resource. The endless feed, then, is not simply a stream of images. It is a manifestation of a worldview that transforms lived experience into consumable units, each waiting to be clicked, liked, and archived. The anxiety that arises from this enframing is not merely personal, it is ontological. We feel unsettled because the world we inhabit no longer offers a horizon of meaning beyond its own self-reproducing loop. The paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz in his 2004 book The Paradox of Choice, further illuminates the mental strain of social media. Schwartz argues that when individuals are presented with too many options, they experience decision paralysis, regret, and diminished satisfaction. On platforms like Instagram and TikTok, the user is bombarded with an infinite array of content, each vying for attention. The act of choosing what to watch, what to like, or what to comment becomes a micro-decision that, when multiplied across thousands of scrolls, creates a cognitive overload. This overload fuels anxiety. What if I'm missing the best content? What if I'm not responding quickly enough? The platform exploits this anxiety by delivering ever more personalized recommendations, tightening the loop of choice and reinforcing the need to stay engaged. In this sense, the prison is not built of physical walls, but of endless possibilities that never resolve, leaving the mind in a state of perpetual anticipation. Now, let us turn to two concrete narratives that illustrate these mechanisms in lived experience. First, there is the story of Maya, a 24-year-old graduate student who, after a semester of intense research, found herself compulsively checking Instagram at least every 10 minutes. She described the habit as a background hum that never ceased, even during lectures or meals. Over time, Maya noticed that her sleep quality deteriorated, her anxiety about social standing intensified, and she began to feel a vague sense of emptiness after each scrolling session, as if something essential had been siphoned away. When she finally participated in a university-run digital detox program, she reported a dramatic reduction in her heart rate variability, a physiological marker of stress, within just 3 days of abstaining. Maya's experience mirrors the findings of the Instagram scroll stop experiment. The removal of the variable ratio reinforcement allowed her nervous system to reset, revealing how deeply the platform had embedded itself into her autonomic regulation. Second, consider the case of Jamal, a 31-year-old freelance videographer who became a prolific TikTok creator during the pandemic. His videos amassed millions of views, and the platform's algorithm constantly served him fresh content that matched his creative style. However, Jamal also reported an escalating sense of urgency to produce content, a fear that any lapse would cause his audience to forget him. He described a dopamine hangover after each posting session, a lingering unease that persisted for hours, compelling him to open the app again to check engagement metrics. When Jamal consulted a therapist trained in cognitive behavioral approaches, he learned to recognize the operant loop and to set digital boundaries, specific times for posting and for checking analytics. Over a period of 6 weeks, his reported anxiety scores dropped by 40%, and he reclaimed a sense of agency over his creative output. Jamal's journey underscores the dual nature of social media. It can amplify one's voice and provide a platform for expression, yet it can also entangle the creator in a self-reinforcing cycle of validation seeking, a modern echo of Sartre's bad faith. These narratives raise an important question. Does the digital sphere inevitably imprison us, or can it be reshaped into a space of genuine connection and well-being? Critics argue that social media, far from being a prison, offers unprecedented opportunities for community building, especially for marginalized groups who might otherwise lack a voice. A 2022 study published in Journal of Community Psychology examined online support groups for individuals with chronic illnesses. Participants reported feeling seen and understood in ways that offline interactions could not replicate. One participant, a teenager with a rare autoimmune condition, wrote, "Before I found the Discord community, I felt isolated in my own body. Now I have friends who speak my language." This testimony aligns with the work of sociologist Sherry Turkle, who in Alone Together acknowledges that digital communication can foster intimacy, albeit in a different form than face-to-face encounters. Similarly, the therapeutic potential of online communities is highlighted in the field of mental health interventions. The Talk Life platform, an app designed for peer-to-peer support among young adults experiencing depression and anxiety, has demonstrated efficacy comparable to traditional group therapy in a randomized controlled trial conducted by the University of Sydney in 2020. Participants who engaged regularly with the platform reported a 28% reduction in depressive symptoms over 8 weeks. These findings suggest that the same mechanisms that can imprison us, instant feedback, community validation, and algorithmic curation, can also be harnessed for healing, provided the design prioritizes safety, moderation, and purposeful interaction over endless scrolling. To reconcile these opposing perspectives, we must look to contemporary philosophy of well-being, particularly the work of Aristotle's modern interpreter, Martha Nussbaum. In Creating Capabilities, Nussbaum outlines 10 central capabilities that constitute a flourishing human life, ranging from bodily health to practical reason and affiliation. Social media can, in principle, support several of these capabilities. It can facilitate affiliation, enable the sharing of knowledge, and provide a platform for artistic expression. However, when the architecture of a platform systematically undermines practical reason, by hijacking attention and reducing reflective capacity, it threatens the very foundation of well-being. Nussbaum's framework invites us to assess technology not merely on its utility, but on its contribution to the broader tapestry of human capabilities. Returning to the historical dimension, the panic surrounding new media is not a novel phenomenon. In the early 1950s, when television entered American living rooms, moral crusaders warned that the glowing boxes would erode family values, promote juvenile delinquency, and turn viewers into passive consumers. A 1955 editorial in the New York Times declared, "Television is the most powerful weapon of mass manipulation ever devised." Yet, as historian Robert Sklar notes in Television, a History, the medium eventually became a conduit for cultural exchange, educational programming, and civic discourse. The pattern repeats with each technological leap. A wave of alarm followed by a period of adaptation and integration. A similar alarm rose in the 1990s with the emergence of online gaming. When massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs, like World of Warcraft gained popularity, psychologists began documenting gaming addiction, a term that would later be recognized by the World Health Organization as gaming disorder. A 1998 study by Dr. Douglas Gentile observed that adolescents who spent more than 20 hours per week on online games exhibited higher levels of social withdrawal and lower academic performance. Yet contemporaneous research also highlighted the benefits of online gaming communities, teamwork, strategic thinking, and cross-cultural interaction. The dual nature of these early digital experiences foreshadows our current ambivalence towards social media. In light of these historical precedents, we might ask whether the current anxiety surrounding social media is simply a cultural echo of past media panics, or whether the neuro-technological sophistication of today's platforms represents a fundamentally new challenge. The answer likely lies somewhere in between. The underlying psychological mechanisms, operant conditioning, social comparison, fear of exclusion, are timeless. What is new is the precision with which algorithms can predict and manipulate these mechanisms at scale, and the speed at which feedback loops occur. The dopamine spikes that once followed a lottery ticket purchase now accompany every swipe, and the scroll-stop cue that once required a conscious decision now can be embedded invisibly in the code. Let us pause then to consider the ethical responsibility of the architects who designed these systems. In his 1975 essay, The Ethics of Technology, Hans Jonas argued that when technology reaches a point where it can shape human behavior on a massive scale, the moral calculus must shift from short-term profit to long-term human flourishing. Jonas wrote, "We are called upon to act responsibly toward the future, to consider the consequences of our inventions for the humanity that will inherit them." This call resonates powerfully in the context of social media. If platforms continue to prioritize engagement metrics, time spent, clicks, ad impressions, over the mental health of users, they risk perpetuating a form of digital incarceration that contravenes the very promise of technology as a liberating force. What then might a more humane design look like? One proposal comes from the field of digital well-being, championed by scholars such as Cal Newport, author of Digital Minimalism. Newport advocates for intentional technology use, where individuals schedule specific periods for deep work and set clear boundaries for social media consumption. On the platform side, features like timeout reminders, usage dashboards, and night mode are early steps, but they remain opt-in mechanisms that rely on users' pre-existing willpower. A more radical approach would involve redesigning the reward architecture itself, perhaps by replacing infinite scroll with curated, finite feeds that encourage reflection, or by integrating pauses that trigger mindfulness prompts, akin to the scroll stop line tested by Instagram. The philosophical tradition offers further guidance. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, the anticipation of potential hardships, can be adapted to digital life. By consciously imagining the emotional turbulence that might follow a barrage of notifications, users can cultivate a measured response, reducing the grip of the dopamine loop. Similarly, Buddhist mindfulness, with its emphasis on observing thoughts without attachment, provides a mental toolset for recognizing the impermanence of digital stimuli. In a 2021 interview, neuroscientist Dr. Judson Brewer described how mindfulness meditation can rewire the brain's habit pathways, decreasing the salience of cues that trigger compulsive scrolling. The convergence of ancient contemplative practices with modern neuroscience suggests that the antidote to digital imprisonment may lie in cultivating attention, rather than in merely limiting exposure. Let us also reflect on the role of community in breaking the cycle. The concept of therapeutic communities, originally developed in the context of addiction recovery, emphasizes collective responsibility, shared narratives, and mutual support. Translating this model to the digital realm could involve creating moderated spaces where users set collective norms, such as no scrolling after midnight or daily gratitude posts, and hold each other accountable. The success of platforms like r/Stop Gaming on Reddit, where members pledge to reduce gaming time and share strategies, demonstrates the potential of peer-driven accountability. By reframing social media from a solitary habit to a shared journey, we may transform the prison walls into a communal garden. In synthesizing these threads, we encounter a central paradox. The same technologies that can imprison us also hold the keys to our liberation. The mechanisms of operant conditioning, dopamine reinforcement, and social comparison are neutral tools. It is the values we embed within them that determine whether they become cages or catalysts. As Sartre reminds us, man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. In the digital age, that freedom includes the choice of how we engage with platforms that constantly vie for our attention. By becoming aware of the psychological levers at play, by questioning the narratives that the feed presents, and by actively shaping our digital environments in alignment with deeper human capabilities, we can begin to dissolve the illusion of freedom that is, in fact, a well-crafted illusion of choice. To conclude this exploration of psychological lockdown, let us revisit the metaphor of the city of light. The doors that close behind us are not immutable. They can be opened with a deliberate turn of the handle, a decision to step back, to pause, to look beyond the flickering screens. The walls of the prison are constructed from variable rewards, endless choices, and the silent whisper of comparison. Yet within those walls there are windows, moments of mindfulness, community support, and purposeful design that let in fresh air and remind us of the world beyond the feed. As we walk forward, let us carry with us the insights of Skinner, Alter, Greenfield, Sartre, Heidegger, and the countless users whose stories echo in the data. Let us ask ourselves not only what the platforms are doing to us, but what we are allowing them to do. In that questioning lies the first step toward a genuine freedom, one that is not measured in likes, but in the quiet confidence of an unburdened mind. Imagine, for a moment, that every notification that lights up your screen is a tiny key turning in a lock you never asked to be given. Each swipe, each like, each algorithmic suggestion is a subtle reinforcement of a cage whose walls are built not of iron or concrete, but of code, data, and habit. The metaphor of the digital prison is not a hyperbolic flourish. It is a lived reality for billions of users whose attention is harvested, whose identities are profiled, and whose choices are nudged by invisible architectures. Yet, as with any prison, the possibility of resistance, of reimagining its very foundations, and of seeking emancipation remains a fertile ground for philosophical inquiry and practical action. When we ask ourselves how we might break free from this digital confinement, the first question is not merely technical, it is fundamentally ethical. What does it mean to design technology that respects the autonomy of the human subject rather than treating the subject as a resource to be optimized? Jaron Lanier, a pioneer of virtual reality and a vocal critic of what he calls the tyranny of the algorithm, offers a starting point. In his book, You Are Not a Gadget, Lanier writes, "We must become the designers of our own tools, not the tools of the designers." This call to agency invites us to consider pathways that shift the balance of power back to the individual, or at least to a collective that can negotiate on equal terms with the corporations that currently dominate the digital landscape. One concrete pathway is the development of decentralized social networks. Mastodon, for instance, is built on the ActivityPub protocol, a set of open standards that allow independent servers, known as instances, to interoperate while retaining control over their own data policies, moderation practices, and community norms. In practice, a user on one Mastodon instance can follow, reply to, and share content with a user on another, all without a single corporate entity governing the entire ecosystem. This architecture embodies what Lawrence Lessig famously declared in Code is Law. The architecture of the internet is a form of law that shapes what we can and cannot do. By distributing the code, by making the very scaffolding of social interaction open, mutable, and replicable, Mastodon offers a glimpse of a digital commons where the law is not imposed from above but negotiated among peers. Yet the promise of decentralization is not without its tensions. Critics argue that the fragmentation of online spaces can dilute the collective power that mass platforms wield, thereby weakening movements that rely on scale. The Arab Spring, for example, demonstrated how a single, globally reachable platform could amplify dissent and coordinate protest across borders. If every community retreats into its own niche server, do we lose the ability to mobilize en masse? This concern mirrors a broader philosophical debate about the trade-off between autonomy and solidarity. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu warned that the more the individual is freed from the constraints of the collective, the more fragile the collective becomes. In the digital realm, the risk is that a proliferation of small, insulated networks could become echo chambers that speak only to themselves, limiting the reach of transformative ideas. A second pathway toward emancipation lies in regulatory frameworks that embed rights into the very fabric of digital interactions. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is perhaps the most ambitious attempt to codify privacy, consent, and accountability as enforceable legal standards. Under GDPR, individuals possess the right to access, rectify, and erase their personal data, a set of powers that directly challenge the data harvesting practices of many social platforms. The regulation also obliges companies to conduct data protection impact assessments, essentially forcing them to anticipate and mitigate harms before they arise. As privacy scholar Daniel J. Solove observes, regulation is not a panacea, but it is a lever that can tilt the balance of power. In this sense, GDPR serves as a legislative key that can unlock the prison doors, at least for those within its jurisdiction. However, the regulatory route is also fraught with counterarguments. Some technologists and economists contend that heavy-handed regulation stifles innovation, creating a chilling effect that discourages experimentation and the rapid iteration that has historically driven the tech sector forward. The economist Joseph Schumpeter famously described creative destruction as the engine of progress, arguing that the destruction of the old is a prerequisite for the birth of the new. If GDPR forces companies to slow down, to invest heavily in compliance teams, does it not risk slowing the very dynamism that fuels breakthroughs? Moreover, the global nature of the internet means that regulations in one jurisdiction can be circumvented by servers located elsewhere, potentially creating a patchwork of compliance that benefits only the most resource-rich corporations. These tensions invite us to look beyond the binary of regulation versus innovation and toward hybrid models that blend human-centric design with accountable governance. Donna Haraway, in her seminal essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, challenges the notion of a monolithic subject, proposing instead a cyborg that is part organism, part machine, and part social construct. She writes the cyborg is a kind of hybrid, part organism. part machine, and it is this hybridity that makes it possible to resist the totalizing narratives of both capitalism and technocracy. In the context of social media, the cyborg metaphor encourages us to envision platforms that are not merely tools or masters, but extensions of our collective agency, systems that we can reconfigure, repurpose, and even dismantle when they betray our values. One illustrative example of this reconfigurable ethos is the open-source software movement of the 1990s. When Linus Torvalds released the Linux kernel in 1991, he did so under the GNU General Public License, a legal framework that required any derivative work to remain open and freely distributable. This decision transformed an academic hobby into a global infrastructure that now powers everything from smartphones to supercomputers. The open source model demonstrates that when code is treated as a commons, shared, audited, and improved by a community, power becomes diffused rather than concentrated. It also offers a historical antecedent to the decentralized social networks we see today, a precedent for building alternatives to proprietary, closed systems. Similarly, the community radio movement of the 1970s provides a cultural analog. In an era when mainstream broadcast media were dominated by a few powerful networks, activists and local organizers banded together to create low-power stations that could broadcast from neighborhood garages and community centers. These stations were not merely platforms for music. They were hubs for grassroots political discourse, local news, and cultural expression that mainstream channels ignored. As media theorist Henry Jenkins notes, community radio was a laboratory for participatory media, a space where the audience could become producers. The legacy of those stations lives on in today's podcasts, live streams, and micro-broadcasts that bypass corporate gatekeepers, reminding us that technology can be reclaimed for democratic purposes. Against this backdrop, contemporary activist movements are demanding algorithmic transparency and digital detox as forms of resistance. The Algorithmic Justice League, founded by Joy Buolamwini, has brought to public attention the ways in which facial recognition and recommendation systems embed biases that perpetuate racial and gender inequities. Their campaigns ask corporations to open their black boxes and allow independent audits, a demand that resonates with Lessig's insight that the code is law, but the law can be rewritten. Meanwhile, the digital detox trend, popularized by retreats, apps that limit screen time, and even entire days designated as screen-free, reflects a personal form of emancipation. It asks individuals to step back, to reclaim time, and to reorient attention toward embodied experiences. As the philosopher Byung-Chul Han observes in The Burnout Society, the digital age has turned us into self-optimizing machines, and the only way to resist is to stop the endless self-exploitation. Detox, then, is not merely a health fad. It is a philosophical act of refusing to be wholly subsumed by the demands of the digital prison. Yet, both algorithmic activism and digital detox face critiques that echo earlier concerns about fragmentation. If each individual or community pursues its own path to emancipation, whether through a private Mastodon instance, a personal data deletion tool, or a weekend retreat, do we risk creating a patchwork of isolated islands? The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative once he has won. In the digital sphere, the fear is that once a critical mass adopts alternative platforms or practices, the mainstream may co-opt these innovations, reinscribing the same power structures under a new veneer. Indeed, we have already witnessed how green features, such as Instagram's hide likes option, are introduced by the platforms they aim to critique, often without substantive change to the underlying data economy. To navigate these complexities, we can turn to the concept of the digital commons. The commons, traditionally understood as shared resources managed by a community according to mutually agreed rules, offers a framework for collective stewardship of digital infrastructure. Elinor Ostrom's seminal work on governing the commons identifies principles such as clearly defined boundaries, collective decision-making, and mechanisms for monitoring and sanctioning. Applied to social media, these principles suggest that users could collectively define norms for data use, enforce them through community-driven moderation, and maintain transparency through open audits. The Fediverse, the network of federated platforms that includes Mastodon, PeerTube, and many others, is an emerging embodiment of this principle, a set of interoperable services that can be governed locally while remaining part of a larger, shared ecosystem. Cross-referencing with cyber-libertarianism, however, reveals a tension. Cyber-libertarians, inspired by the early Internet's ethos of the network as a neutral conduit, argue for minimal interference, emphasizing the primacy of individual freedom and market dynamics. They contend that any form of collective governance risks imposing a digital tyranny of the majority. Yet, as Jaron Lanier cautions, when the market becomes the sole arbiter of what we value, it reduces us to the sum of our data points. The balance, then, lies in designing systems that are both open enough to foster innovation and robust enough to protect against exploitation, a design challenge that sits at the heart of the ethics of design. Ethical design as a discipline asks us to ask not just can we build this, but should we build this, and for whom? The designer's responsibility extends to anticipating how a feature might be weaponized, how an interface might nudge behavior, and how data might be repurposed. In the words of the design theorist Donald Norman, design is really an act of communication, and we need to make sure that communication is honest. When applied to social media, honest communication means revealing the incentives that drive content promotion, the trade-offs inherent in privacy settings, and the potential societal impacts of algorithmic amplification. This transparency can be operationalized through design audits, a practice where independent experts evaluate a platform's user experience, data policies, and algorithmic logic, publishing findings that inform both users and regulators. Consider the example of the right to explanation embedded in the EU's AI Act, a proposed regulation that would require automated decision-making systems to provide understandable reasons for their outputs. While still under debate, this provision reflects an emerging consensus that users deserve to know why a particular post is suggested, why a friend is recommended, or why a piece of content is censored. If such explanations become standard, the opacity that currently fuels the prison metaphor could be dismantled, allowing individuals to make informed choices about their digital environments. Another modern illustration of reimagining the digital prison comes from the rise of data cooperatives. These are member-owned entities that pool personal data under democratic governance, allowing individuals to collectively negotiate the terms of data use and to share the economic benefits of their data. The Finnish startup Helsinki Data Hub is experimenting with a model where citizens can opt into data sharing that fuels public services, while retaining the right to withdraw consent at any time. This cooperative approach reframes data not as a commodity to be extracted, but as a shared resource that can be stewarded for the common good, a direct challenge to the extractive logic of most social media platforms. Yet the feasibility of such cooperatives raises questions about scalability and sustainability. Can a data cooperative compete with the massive economies of scale that companies like Meta and Google enjoy? Critics argue that the network effects that make platforms valuable are precisely what make alternatives fragile. If a cooperative cannot attract a critical mass of users, its data pool remains too small to be useful, and the incentive to join diminishes, a classic chicken and egg problem. Moreover, the administrative overhead of democratic governance, voting, deliberation, conflict resolution, may slow decision-making, potentially impeding rapid response to emerging threats or opportunities. These challenges are not insurmountable, however. Historical precedents suggest that collective action can overcome entrenched power structures when motivated by shared values and clear objectives. The open source movement succeeded not because every developer abandoned proprietary software, but because a critical mass recognized the moral and practical benefits of openness and organized around shared standards. Similarly, the community radio movement persisted because it tapped into a deep desire for local representation and cultural expression, offering a tangible alternative to homogenized broadcast content. In both cases, the success of the movement hinged on creating a sense of belonging, establishing clear norms, and leveraging technology that was accessible to ordinary participants. In the present moment, we see a convergence of these historical lessons with contemporary tools. The blockchain, for instance, offers a way to embed governance rules directly into the code of a platform, making them immutable unless a consensus is reached to modify them. Projects like Mastodon have experimented with instance federation that can be governed by a set of shared policies, while still allowing each community to tailor its own rules. Meanwhile, the rise of algorithmic impact statements, akin to environmental impact statements, seeks to make the effects of recommendation engines visible and accountable. These innovations suggest that the architecture of the digital prison can be retrofitted with windows and doors, provided that designers, regulators, and users collaborate. Returning to the philosophical core, the question of emancipation is not merely about escaping surveillance or regaining privacy. It is about redefining what it means to be a social being in an age where interaction is mediated by code. As Haraway reminds us, the cyborg is a creature in a post-genders world, a creature without a sexed body. In the digital sphere, our bodies are already extended through avatars, profiles, and data trails. Emancipation, then, involves reclaiming the narrative of those extensions, ensuring that they serve our aspirations rather than our exploitation. It is an invitation to co-author the story of our digital lives, to shape the algorithms that shape us, and to imagine a future where the network is not a prison but a garden, a cultivated space where diverse voices can grow, intertwine, and bear fruit. To make this vision concrete, consider two actionable pathways that individuals and communities can pursue today. First, adopt a toolbox approach to digital engagement. Use privacy-enhancing browsers, install tracker blockers, and periodically audit the permissions you grant to apps. By consciously curating the digital tools you allow into your life, you create a personal perimeter that limits the reach of the prison's walls. Second, participate in collective initiatives that aim to reshape the infrastructure itself. Join a Mastodon instance that aligns with your values, contribute to open-source projects that improve transparency, or support policy campaigns that demand algorithmic audits. These actions, while seemingly modest, accumulate into a pressure that can bend the architecture of the network toward greater openness. Yet, we must also heed the counterarguments that warn against an overly fragmented landscape. The philosopher Charles Taylor has argued that the health of a community depends on a shared horizon of meaning. If each user retreats into a private digital enclave, the shared horizon may erode, leaving us with a multitude of isolated islands lacking common ground for political deliberation or cultural exchange. This is not a trivial concern. Democratic societies rely on public spheres where diverse viewpoints can be aired, contested, and synthesized. Social media, for all its flaws, has at times served as a global agora, enabling movements from Me Too to climate justice to coalesce across borders. Any redesign must preserve or even enhance the capacity for collective deliberation. In response, proponents of decentralization argue that the current centralized platforms have already compromised the public sphere by curating content according to opaque profit motives. The filter bubble phenomenon, first described by Eli Pariser, demonstrates how algorithmic personalization can isolate users from dissenting perspectives, thereby weakening the democratic function of the public sphere. Decentralized platforms, by allowing communities to set their own moderation policies and algorithmic weights, can foster a plurality of public spheres rather than a monolithic one. The key is to ensure interoperability so that ideas can still flow between these spheres, preventing the ossification of echo chambers. Regulation, too, faces the critique that it may stifle the very innovation that fuels progress. The economist Mariana Mazzucato, however, challenges the notion that innovation is solely the domain of the private sector. She argues that the state is the venture capitalist of the 21st century, pointing to historical investments in the internet, GPS, and biotechnology that were initially funded by public money. In this light, GDPR and similar regulations can be viewed not as constraints, but as public investments in the infrastructure of trust, a necessary substrate for sustainable innovation. When users trust that their data will be handled responsibly, they are more likely to engage, share, and co-create, ultimately enriching the digital ecosystem. The dialogue between regulation and innovation can also be enriched by the concept of regulatory sandboxes, experimental environments where new technologies are tested under relaxed regulatory oversight with safeguards in place to monitor risks. The UK's Financial Conduct Authority has employed sandboxes to foster fintech innovation, and similar models are being proposed for AI and social media. Such sandboxes could allow decentralized platforms to pilot novel governance models, while regulators observe and refine policies based on real-world outcomes. This iterative approach respects the dynamism of the tech sector while ensuring that ethical considerations are not sidelined. Amid these theoretical discussions, the lived experience of users offers a powerful counterpoint. The digital detox movement, popularized by figures such as Cal Newport in Digital Minimalism, emphasizes the intentional reduction of screen time to reclaim mental space and foster deeper relationships. Newport's advice to schedule offline days, to batch social media checks, and to replace scrolling with solitary reading reflects a personal form of emancipation that does not depend on systemic overhaul. Yet personal discipline alone cannot dismantle structural inequities. It must be complemented by collective action that reshapes the conditions under which digital attention is harvested. Activist groups like Fight for the Future, which organized the 2011 Internet blackout to protest SOPA and PIPA, illustrate how coordinated digital actions can pressure corporations and legislators alike. More recently, the Algorithmic Transparency Initiative, launched by a coalition of NGOs, academics, and technologists, has petitioned major platforms to publish the criteria used in content recommendation engines. Their demand is not merely technical, it is a call for democratic oversight over the invisible forces that shape public discourse. As the activist scholar Siva Vaidyanathan notes, control of the network is control of the narrative. By demanding transparency, activists aim to transform the network from a prison into a forum where power is visible and contestable. Historical anecdotes remind us that the struggle for communicative freedom has always involved a tension between centralization and decentralization. The community radio movement of the 1970s emerged as a response to the monopolistic control of mainstream broadcasters, using low-power transmitters and volunteer staff to broadcast local news, music, and political commentary. These stations faced legal challenges, yet their persistence forced regulatory bodies to recognize the value of diverse voices, leading to the establishment of the Federal Communications Commission's (FCC) low-power FM service in the United States. This victory demonstrates how grassroots organization, coupled with strategic legal advocacy, can reshape the media landscape. Similarly, the open-source software revolution of the 1990s showed how a community of developers could collectively produce robust, secure, and widely adopted software without the profit motives that drive proprietary development. The creation of the Apache HTTP server, the Linux kernel, and the GNU tools provided the backbone for the modern Internet. These projects were guided by a philosophy that software should be free to use, modify, and share, a principle codified in the GNU General Public License. The success of open source illustrates that when the code itself is treated as a commons, the power dynamics shift dramatically, allowing users to become co-creators rather than passive consumers. Cross-referencing these historical moments with contemporary theories of the digital commons underscores a continuity in the human desire to reclaim agency over communicative technologies. The digital commons, as articulated by scholars like Yacha Benkler, envisions a networked environment where information and cultural artifacts are produced and shared collectively, with minimal barriers to participation. Benkler argues that the networked information economy can foster a new kind of commons that is both inclusive and productive. In practice, this means designing platforms that lower entry costs, protect contributors' rights, and encourage remixing and collaboration. The decentralized social networks and data cooperatives we discussed earlier are contemporary embodiments of this vision. Yet, the digital commons also confronts the specter of tragedy of the commons, where unregulated use leads to depletion or degradation of shared resources. In the digital realm, this manifests as misinformation, harassment, and platform overload. Addressing these challenges requires governance mechanisms that balance openness with accountability. One promising model is participatory governance, where users are invited to co-design moderation policies, contribute to algorithmic audits, and vote on platform changes. Platforms like Minds and Diaspora have experimented with such models, offering users a stake in the rules that govern their interactions. While these experiments are still nascent, they illustrate how the digital commons can be stewarded responsibly. The ethical design of social media also calls for a re-examination of the incentives that drive platform behavior. The prevailing attention economy model treats user engagement as the primary metric of success, incentivizing sensationalist content, endless scrolling, and persuasive design techniques often called dark patterns. Jaron Lanier warns that the attention economy turns us into a commodity and the market decides what we should think. To counter this, designers can adopt human-centered metrics, such as user well-being, community health, and meaningful interaction, rather than sheer time on site. Companies like Basecamp have famously eschewed infinite scroll in favor of a static, task-oriented interface, demonstrating that profitability and humane design need not be mutually exclusive. In contemplating the possibility of digital emancipation, we must also consider the role of imagination. Philosophers from Plato to Baudrillard have argued that the transformation of society begins with the ability to envision alternatives. The digital garden metaphor, popularized by software developer and writer S.J. the Gardener, encourages us to see platforms as ecosystems that require cultivation, pruning, and occasional replanting. In a garden, each plant contributes to the overall health of the environment. Similarly, each user's contribution, whether a post, a comment, or a code commit, shapes the digital landscape. By nurturing diversity, encouraging mutual aid, and resisting invasive species, malware, misinformation, monopolistic practices, we can cultivate a garden that sustains rather than confines. Ultimately, the question of whether we can break free from the digital prison or must redesign it from within is not a binary choice. It is a spectrum of possibilities that spans personal habits, collective movements, technological innovation, and legislative action. The thinkers we have invoked, Lanier's call for human-centric tools, Lessig's insight that code is law, Haraway's cyborgian vision, each illuminate a different facet of the path forward. Their ideas intersect with historical precedents, from community radio to open source, and with contemporary experiments in decentralization, regulation, and activism. As we close this segment, pause for a moment and reflect on your own relationship with the digital world. Ask yourself, which walls of the prison have you already begun to dismantle, whether by turning off notifications, by joining a federated network, or by advocating for transparency? Which walls remain intact, reinforced by the convenience of endless feeds and the allure of personalized content? And perhaps most importantly, what role will you play in building the new architecture, one that honors autonomy, fosters solidarity, and nurtures a shared digital commons? In the words of Donna Haraway, we are all, in some sense, cyborgs, and the only way out of the prison is to reprogram ourselves. The tools are in our hands, the code is open, and the future, though uncertain, is waiting to be co-authored. Let us step forward together, with thoughtful design, collective will, and an unwavering belief that emancipation is not a distant ideal, but a reachable horizon.